There probably doesn't exist a more glorified group of people in history than the Vikings, with popular media depicting them as these strong, manly, heroic sigmas, but I'm here to tell you that the truth is much more complicated, and the Vikings were actually kind of pathetic and sad. Hey Slavic Vikings, and as you know, I am half Danish, and Denmark belongs to Scandinavia, and by definition, the Vikings were Scandinavian seafaring pirates. The most interesting part of the Vikings is probably the fact that they lived such a long time ago, before Christianity was really popular in Europe, and before even Poland existed, that being the 8th to 11th century. So these are the official main settlements of the Vikings. So as you can see, they lived all around Scandinavia. But if you look here, one of the cities that they settled 1,000 years ago is called Viborg. And if you look at the map, that city is right here. I used to live in this city for a while, or around the area. And it's kind of cool that I lived for a year in a city that was colonized originally by Vikings. Or I should say settled. Before we get into why the Vikings sucked, let's get a broad understanding of the areas they settled, because I feel like that's kind of important for the context of this video. So first of all, as you can see, the dark red area is their homeland, that being Scandinavia. And nowadays, Scandinavia is very sparsely populated, and this was even more the case back in the day. So therefore, when we look at this map, it is incredible to imagine that such a small amount of people had so much influence and caused so much destruction all around Europe. They even went all the way to North America before Columbus, and they named it Vinland. That's right, Americans, we were there first. And this green color shows that these areas were raided instead of settled. And that's the issue when you have such a small population. It's very hard to create an empire when you're so sparsely populated. So unlike the Mongols or the Roman Empire, the Vikings, they kind of just went to places, raided, raped, and did all the classic pirate stuff. And then they either just stayed and assimilated to the local culture, or just stole all their shit and went back to Scandinavia. So therefore, they were considered pirates and not, you know, imperial expanders or whatever. But if you take a look, they even had official colonies in Sicily. They controlled all of Sicily. The Vikings were even in Africa. They controlled all of England. Basically, all Russians now are descendants of the Vikings, since the Rus state was settled by Viking trading routes going through them to trade with the Byzantine Empire. And this is extremely interesting. So first of all, I have a confession to make, because my entire persona is a lie. The Viking helmet you can see on my profile picture doesn't exist. The Vikings never wore helmets with horns, or at least there is no evidence of this. Actually, there's only one real Viking helmet that's in full that has been discovered, and it's called the Gjermundbu helmet. This helmet right here, it was in a bunch of little pieces, they put it together. This is the first and only full Viking helmet that they found, and as you can see, it has no horns on it. Wake up, Americans. Your favorite football club, or I should say American football club, is fake, or the logo is fake. This never happened. The Vikings didn't have this helmet. This is a show that I watched when I was a little kid, and it's based on the Vikings, and you can see they have horned helmets, but this is fake. But I forgive them, because this is, you know, a show about dragons, so they don't have to be historically accurate. Who else had these helmets? Asterix and Obelix. I'm sure we all loved this show when we were kids. Even though the horns are tiny on Asterix or Obelix, I don't know which one is which, these horns never happened. You see, these tiny ass horns, fake. These ones in the background. And Clash of Clans Barbarian max level is also fake. And Elite Barbarian also, you can see. The Elite Barbarian in Clash Royale and in Clash of Clans, when you upgrade it, it has a helmet, as you can see here. This is a fake Viking. I love Clash of Clans. I've been playing it a lot recently. But also Lego. But whose fault is this, that this lie is misrepresented about these Vikings? And as it turns out, it's this guy's fault. Or, sorry, that's another lie, it's this guy's father. He's called Emil Doppler. His dad was also called Emil Doppler. I couldn't find any images of this guy's father, but whatever, it's close enough. He has the same name, same genetics. It's because his dad was an opera writer. He wrote an opera called Wagner's operas. They lasted like 12 hours, it was crazy. And in the costume design for this opera, he basically made these fake helmets. These operas were called also Der Ring des Nibelungen. And as you can see, they looked pretty epic. And they were basically mythologizing the Vikings, doing tales about them and putting these fake helmets on them. And the entire lie came from this. And since then, it spread into propaganda for the Nordics and Germany to be proud of their heritage of being Vikings. So, to be fair, let's not pretend like horned helmets did not exist. They did exist, but hundreds of years before the Vikings, in the Iron Age. And they had nothing to do with Vikings, and they were purely ceremonial. And this is how they looked. As you can see, they were quite interesting looking and cool, kind of satanic, but nothing to do with Vikings. The average Viking was poor as fuck. To be able to afford a helmet back in that day was a huge luxury. And therefore 99.9% of the Vikings were just going into battle in their everyday clothes and could not afford such luxuries as helmets. One of the main arguments I found online on why Vikings didn't wear these horned helmets was because it would be considered impractical, since they would give no benefit and would only hinder your movement in battle. But to me this just sounds silly. Because if we look a couple hundreds years afterwards, we have the Polish Hussars. I'm sure you've heard of them before. It's this legendary group of cavalry in the Polish army that killed the Ottomans with a 10-1 disadvantage. And this was basically the most dominant army in all of Europe for quite some time. And as you can see, they would wear these large-ass, gay-ass wings in the back of their horses. And there's no way these had any practical usages other than literally just to scare their enemies. Imagine you see a warrior just sprinting at you with a bunch of wings on their backs on a horse. The intimidation factor of such aesthetics has huge value in battle. And I could imagine that if these hypothetical Vikings had horns on their helmets, it would, have some value to scare the Christians into, giving up or something. Much like I'm sure many warriors did during the Middle Ages when Poland would run into their enemy with huge wings on their back. They looked scary, especially when, everyone believed in God and stuff and it looks like a fucking angel running at you. You get my point. The Vikings had a shit ton of beef with the Christians, since the Vikings were known to kill monks and priests and raid churches and raid people who were defenseless and were peaceful. They would just attack anyone, and if someone was religious and therefore didn't like violence, that was just more of a target for the Vikings. And spoiler alert, what made the Vikings disappear was the spread of Christianity. It's not clear how much of this is direct conquest or influence, but I truly believe that Christianity and its moral values were the inherent cause of the collapse of the Vikings. Since, with the morality of Christianity being more and more popular, which I'm sure it was in Scandinavia, it just seemed really fucked up what the Vikings were doing. And even the very beginning of the Viking Age, which was the year 793, where they raided an island in England. So this original raid to this British island that started the Viking Age is very interesting because this island was extremely important for the beginning of Christianity around Europe and for Brittany, and there was a big debate on why God could allow such suffering in such a place. I have sources in the description of the video, so read this article here from the English Heritage, it's very interesting. But one of the most famous examples of the brutality of the Vikings is the Blood Eagle. I'm sure you've heard of this, and it is kind of nasty. So the Blood Eagle is where Vikings would cut up the back of their victims and spread out their ribs to give them fake wings. And it kind of looked like this. And it was basically just to torture their rivals. So I have to be clear that It is debated in, historians whether this actually happened or not, but I'll say it did happen because it's kind of cool. But there are many examples like this where the Vikings would purposefully be as brutal as possible, and you might say to yourself, well, Polish Dane, this can't be all because of the lack of Christianity. Don't people have inherent morals? And yes, I do think that morality is possible without religion. However, this was a deliberate tactic, since the more brutal you are in war, the more brutal you are in raids, the more rumors are spread around Europe about your brutality, and the higher the chance that your next victim will just give up, because they don't want their back opened up and for you to have fake wings and fly away. Anyway, another reason the Vikings kind of sucked is because most of them were just farmers. That's right, you think all of the population was just freaking warriors? No. Most of the people were normal farmers, and they basically just prepared all year. And then during summer, they basically did a yearly raid to Europe for grocery shopping. In the 10th century, an Arab envoy said and described a Norse funeral where a slave girl was raped and then ritually killed to join her master in the afterlife. Like, the Vikings raided monasteries and towns and did mass raping raids. Like, it's crazy. So, we have Vikings, right? And then we have
Epic
Super Vikings. And these guys were called Berserkers. And these were, you could say, special Vikings that would use trance-like state in a connection to the god of Odin to rush into battle into an emotional state of pure rage and hatred with the godly power inside them to rape and kill as much as possible. I truly believe that war is a very hard thing to do. Like, if you're a man in a battlefield, it's not as simple as just run straight into the enemy and give your life for whatever purpose. Like, personally, if I was in war, and, I'm joining the military in, 3 months, so maybe I shouldn't say this, but if I was in actual war, I feel like, I would just care about my own survival first, by, hiding and running away and something. But, you know what I mean. You need something special to be motivated to give your life for something. And the Vikings, they had Odin. They would go into a trance-like state, into a connection with their god to run into battle. And when thinking about this and doing research, I found that, these berserkers, they had an interesting tactic to motivate them to battle. Very manly, very cool and spiritualistic. But throughout the decades, different armies have used different tactics to motivate their troops into battle. For example, the Nazis, they used drugs. That's right, especially during the invasion of Poland and France. And Hitler personally also took a shit ton of drugs. The Nazi soldiers during World War II were literally prescribed amphetamines, like heroin and shit. It was crazy. They would just drug their soldiers so they didn't have to sleep for multiple days and could just, in an angry, drug-filled rage, run into the enemy. It's kind of OP, and you're kind of creating these super soldiers. So the Nazis, they used drugs, and the Soviets, to motivate their troops, they used something called barrier troops. They've been using this tactic since World War I, where when Soviets fight a battle to motivate their troops, they just have 2 front lines. They have one front line for the enemy, and a second front line a couple kilometers back for any retreating army. This was especially used during World War I and the Russian Civil War, and also World War II a lot. So many different tactics have been used in different time to motivate men to fight in battle. It's a very tough thing. When I fight in World War III to kill Putin, I wonder what they'll use to motivate me. Maybe they'll play Little Dark Age and speakers and measure my kill to death ratio to motivate me. Let's see. World War III will be fun. This is probably my favorite Viking meme because it shows a humorous map of Europe according to the Vikings. So if we go back to this map here, we can see the places they settled. First of all, the Rus states you can see here. The Vikings settled this area and traveled through it a lot. And the reason for that is that they wanted to get to Turkey and stuff to trade. And when they were trading through the Volga River here, or I don't know, I think it's the Volga River, they would travel through the Orient Express, as this map claims, to get to its trading partners. And that's why this map is calling it camping site, because that's basically what it was for them. And, you know, some of them stayed and they became Russians and Ukrainians and stuff. So then in Sweden, northern Sweden, we have the elves and trolls. And this is referencing the fact that in Finland and in northern Sweden, they were settled by the Sami people. The Sami people, you know, they're closely related to Greenlandish people, to Inuit people, who originally came from Mongolia, like, well, I think it's 20,000 years ago, from North America. That's why the Vikings thought that there were elves and trolls in Finland and Sweden. And it's also kind of cool because elves and trolls in general are a big part of Viking culture. The Vikings were very mythical people, and this is in connection to the fact that they were pagans. They were not Christians. They didn't have a real strong, stable religion, and it was very fluid. Therefore, they believed in trolls and elves, in gnomes, and many mythical creatures, which I think is pretty cool. Then here in southern Spain, we have people with manners. And I believe this is in reference to the fact that Muslims were under control over most of Iberia during this point. We have the wild Slavs here, retarded cousins, sexually repressed freaks in northern Italy and Austria. Maybe, I think this is in reference to them being extreme Catholics, like them being obsessed with religion and not allowing gay stuff, and the Vikings liked gay stuff, so that's why these are sexually repressed freaks. Then we can see flea markets around the places, which is places where the Vikings would come to raid and get free stuff. Kind of like a, you know, sarcastic way to call it flea markets. We have the Sea of the Sweaty People, maybe because they were tryhards and they were fighting them. I don't know, man, I just like this map. It's a very elegant and it's a simple way to show what the Vikings thought during that time. We also have the American Highway, since this was the way the Vikings went to Vinland, what they named America. Very cool. So I'm also not sure why France is called the House of Cards. Maybe because they had like an unstable government. Whatever. Interesting map. Coming back to the thing about them going into this trance-like state into battle. And this is because when they would go into the battle and they believed that Odin would give them courage and all this shit, it was because they believed that in their afterlife they would be in something called the Party Hall of the Dead, where the more courageous and more epic you were during your fight, the better place you would have in the afterlife, which, you know, kind of explains their motivation a bit. They also were very illiterate. The only writings they did were like a couple words into stones and some short stories. They weren't scholars, they didn't have libraries, they weren't very intellectual, like you could say about the Greeks or Romans. But, you know, they compensated with their strength. And so, in summary, the Vikings are kind of overrated. Obviously, this video is kind of facetious. Don't take this stuff too seriously. I obviously still think Vikings are pretty cool. I have them as my profile picture and my intro and my outro, which you'll hear in a second. But I also would like to thank anyone who wrote a comment on my last video of why Europe is cooked. I really appreciate all the long, thoughtful comments of people disagreeing or agreeing with me. I've read all of them. I haven't replied to all of them. Maybe I should actually get to that now. But yes, thank you for watching. Please consider subscribing and liking if you like content like this. Very important, check out the history playlist. I have a playlist on videos on history that are all videos very similar to this one. And as always, farewell, żegnam, and goodbye.